The Demon of the Bayou. In the spring of 1834, New Orleans was a transformed city. Decades had passed since colonial days, and now under the American flag, the city had blossomed into a vibrant and dangerous metropolis. The French Quarter teemed with merchants, gamblers, prostitutes, and Creole aristocrats. The slave market was one of the busiest in the South, and in the bayous surrounding the city, stories whispered in taverns spoke of things that happened in the darkness, far from the eyes of the law. It was in this world that two men lived whose destinies would intertwine in terrible ways. The first was Cornelius Blackwood, a 45-year-old cotton planter originally from South Carolina. Tall, broad-shouldered, with graying blonde hair and eyes as cold and blue as ice, Blackwood was considered one of the richest and most powerful men in Louisiana. He had arrived in New Orleans 15 years earlier with a fortune inherited from his father, expanding it through brutally efficient plantations and shrewd investments. Educated in Charleston and later in London, cultured and refined in appearance, he embodied the Southern aristocracy at its peak. But Blackwood harbored secrets that would make even the most depraved men of New Orleans recoil in horror. The second man was Ezekiel Thorne, a 37-year-old private investigator who had arrived in New Orleans 3 years earlier, fleeing an obscure past in Boston. Thorne was the antithesis of Blackwood, short, muscular, with disheveled brown hair and a face marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his chin, a reminder of a knife wound received years ago. His brown eyes were perpetually suspicious, always calculating, always seeking the truth behind appearances. Thorne had been a police detective in Boston until a scandal forced him to leave. He had discovered that his captain was involved in extortion and bribery, and upon reporting him discovered that the corruption ran deeper than he had imagined. Threats were made, evidence disappeared, and Thorne found himself without a job and with a price on his head. New Orleans, with its chaotic and anonymous nature, seemed the perfect refuge. Now he made his living as a private investigator, working on cases that New Orleans' corrupt police ignored. Missing wives, unpaid debts, petty crimes that didn't interest the city's great powers. Everything changed on the morning of April 15, 1834. Marie-Claire Rousseau, a 19-year-old free woman of color, did not return home after her work as a seamstress in one of the French Quarter boutiques. Her mother, Céleste Rousseau, a proud woman who had purchased her own freedom and her daughters years ago, went to the police. She was treated with disdain. Women of color disappeared frequently in New Orleans, and the police rarely cared. Desperate, Céleste spent her meager savings to hire Thorne. She appeared in his small office above a tavern on Rue Dauphine, her hands trembling as she placed worn coins on his desk. "Please, Mr. Thorne," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Marie-Claire is all I have. She's a good girl, never got into trouble. She just disappeared." Thorne, who prided himself on his emotional toughness, felt something contract in his chest. There was something in the pure pain in that mother's eyes that touched a part of him he thought was dead. "Keep your money," he said softly. "I'll find your daughter." He began where he always began, at the last places where Marie-Claire had been seen. The boutique where she worked, called La Maison de Soie, was owned by a French widow named Madame Beaumont. The woman confirmed that Marie-Claire had left work at 6 in the evening, as she always did, walking toward the Tremé, the neighborhood where she lived with her mother. "She was a good worker," said Madame Beaumont, genuinely concerned. "Quiet, skilled with the needle. I can't imagine where she could be." Thorne interviewed neighbors along the route that Marie-Claire normally followed. Most saw nothing, but an old fruit vendor named Samuel remembered seeing the young woman being approached by an elegant carriage near Rue Rampart. "It was a fine carriage," Samuel said, "black with silver trim. I saw a white gentleman speaking to her through the window. I thought perhaps it was a wealthy client from the boutique. She seemed hesitant, but then got into the carriage. After that, I didn't see her anymore." A fine carriage. A wealthy gentleman. In New Orleans, this described half the white and affluent male population. But it was a start. Thorne spent the following days investigating black carriages with silver trim. There were dozens of them in the city. But through careful questions to coachmen and horse handlers, he narrowed the list to 5 owners. Among them was Cornelius Blackwood. The name made several of Thorne's informants visibly nervous. A free Irish coachman named Patrick finally confided, "Mr. Thorne, you're entering dangerous waters. Blackwood is untouchable in this city. He has money, power, connections. If you're investigating him, you'd better stop now." But Thorne was not a man to stop. He began to discreetly watch Blackwood, observing his movements, his habits. The planter maintained a predictable routine. He visited his properties during the day, dined at the finest restaurants, frequented theaters and ballrooms at night. He was the image of respectability. But twice a week, always on Thursday and Sunday nights, Blackwood would leave alone in his black carriage, heading for the bayous south of the city. He always returned before dawn. Thorne decided to follow him. On the following Thursday, he rented a horse and waited in the shadows near Blackwood's mansion in the Garden District. At 10 o'clock at night, the carriage left, with Blackwood driving it personally, without a coachman. This was already unusual. Men of his position never drove their own carriages. Thorne followed at a safe distance, using the full moon to illuminate the path without needing a lantern. The carriage left the city, entering the muddy roads that wound through the swamps. They traveled for almost an hour, venturing into increasingly remote regions. Finally, Blackwood's carriage stopped near an old abandoned plantation. Thorne recognized the place. It had been one of the great properties of the region decades ago, but had been abandoned after its owner's death under mysterious circumstances. Locals said the place was haunted. Thorne tied his horse away from the road and approached on foot, moving silently through the trees covered with Spanish moss. The mansion was a Gothic ruin, its white columns stained and cracked, broken windows like empty eyes staring into the night. Blackwood entered the mansion carrying a lantern. Thorne waited a few minutes, then followed, his hand on the Colt revolver he always carried. The interior of the mansion smelled of mold and decay. Thorne moved cautiously, following the dim light of Blackwood's lantern. Voices echoed from somewhere below. There was a basement. Finding a stone staircase descending into the darkness, Thorne descended slowly, each step calculated to make no noise. The voices became clearer. There were several people down there. What Thorne saw when he reached the base of the stairs would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. The basement had been transformed into something out of the worst Gothic tales. Torches burned in brackets on the damp stone walls. In the center of the space was a stone altar stained with what appeared to be dried blood. Strange symbols were painted on the walls, some that Thorne recognized from the voodoo practiced by slaves, others that seemed to come from obscure European traditions, medieval grimoires he had seen in old engravings. And around the altar stood 6 hooded men in black robes. Cornelius Blackwood, without a hood, was officiating some kind of ritual. In an iron cage in the corner, Thorne saw 3 young women, all of color, all terrified. One of them was Marie-Claire Rousseau. Horror and fury exploded in Thorne's chest. He took a step forward, ready to intervene, when a rotten board gave way under his foot. The noise echoed through the basement. All faces turned in his direction. "We have a visitor," Blackwood said calmly, his deep South drawl maintaining its polish even in that macabre context. How unfortunate. 2 of the hooded men advanced toward Thorne. He drew his revolver. "Stop! Don't take another step." But they didn't stop. Thorne fired, hitting one of them in the chest. The man fell, but the others continued advancing, moving with unnatural coordination. Thorne realized too late that he was clearly outnumbered. He turned to flee up the stairs, but 2 more men had appeared behind him, blocking his exit. He fought fiercely, firing his revolver until it was empty, then using it as a club, but was finally overpowered. When he awoke, he was tied to a chair in the basement itself. His head throbbed where he had been struck. Blood dripped from a cut on his forehead. Blackwood was sitting comfortably in an opposite chair, cleaning his nails with a small knife. The other men had removed their hoods. Thorne recognized some of them. A local judge, a prosperous merchant, even a pastor from a Protestant church. Respectable men of New Orleans, all white, all powerful. "Mr. Thorne," Blackwood said with his characteristic accent, as if they were discussing business, "you've become a problem. I knew someone would eventually ask the wrong questions, but I hoped it would be an incompetent detective who could be easily bribed. You unfortunately seem to have principles." "You're a monster," Thorne spat, pulling against the ropes binding him. "What are you doing with these women?" Blackwood smiled, an expression that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. "Doing? My dear sir, we are simply participating in ancient traditions." much older than this young and puritanical nation. There are powers in this world that ordinary men cannot comprehend. Powers that require sacrifices. You're insane. Insane? Blackwood stood, walking slowly around Thorne. I came to Louisiana with a modest fortune and transformed it into an empire. I have plantations that produce more than any others in the state. I have influence that reaches Washington. I have pleasures that ordinary men will never know. And all because I understand something fundamental. This world belongs to those willing to take what they desire, no matter the price. He gestured to the women in the cage. These women, nobody cares about them. They're free women of color, invisible to the society we've built, perfect for our purposes. Their lives feed our rituals, and nobody asks questions. Nobody investigates, except you. Thorne looked at Marie Claire. The young woman was pale with terror, but her eyes met his with a spark of desperate hope. You can't just kill me, Thorne said, trying to buy time. People know I'm investigating. My disappearance will raise questions. Blackwood laughed, a harsh sound. Mr. Thorne, you're a private investigator without family, without real friends, with an obscure past. In New Orleans, men like you disappear every day. You'll be found in the river or in some alley, victim of robbery. That is, if you're found at all. One of the other men, the judge, spoke with a Louisiana accent. Cornelius, we need to finish the ritual. The moon is in the right position for only 1 more hour. Blackwood nodded. Yes, you're right. Mr. Thorne, I regret to inform you that you will witness our ritual and then become part of it. Consider yourself honored. We rarely use white men. Your blood will add an interesting spice. They began to prepare the altar again. Thorne pulled desperately against the ropes, but they were too tight. His mind raced, searching for any way to escape. That's when he noticed something. One of the torches on the wall was near his chair, perhaps 5 feet away. If he could swing the chair toward it. While the men were distracted with their preparations, Thorne began to rock his body, tilting the chair. Little by little, he moved toward the torch. Finally, he managed to position the ropes on his hands near the flame. The pain was intense when the fire touched his skin along with the rope, but he bit his lips to keep from screaming. The rope began to burn, weakening. What are you doing? One of the cultists noticed. But it was too late. The ropes broke. Thorne freed himself, grabbed the torch, and threw it at the robes of one of the cultists. The fabric caught fire instantly. Chaos erupted in the basement. While the men tried to put out the fire, Thorne ran to the cage, tearing off the latch and freeing the women. Run! Get out of here! Marie Claire and the others needed no further incentive. They ran for the stairs. Blackwood roared with rage, grabbing an ornamental sword that was on the altar. You've ruined everything! He attacked Thorne with surprising expertise. The investigator barely managed to dodge, grabbing a piece of broken wood to defend himself. The 2 men fought brutally, exchanging blows in the burning basement. Thorne was losing. Blackwood was bigger, stronger, trained in fencing. A thrust cut deep into Thorne's shoulder, making him scream in pain. But then, one of the barrels stored in the basement exploded with the heat of the fire. The explosion knocked both men down. The old structure of the basement began to collapse. Let's get out of here, shouted the judge, already running for the stairs with the other cultists. Blackwood, with blood dripping from a cut on his forehead, looked at Thorne with pure hatred. This isn't over, he hissed, before running for the exit. Thorne tried to follow him, but his shoulder wound was severe. He barely managed to climb the stairs before the basement ceiling completely collapsed. The old mansion was being consumed by flames. Outside, he found Marie Claire and the other 2 women, all in shock but alive. Blackwood's carriage had already departed, along with the horses of the other cultists. We need to go, Thorne said, fighting against the dizziness from blood loss. Before they come back, using Thorne's horse, which fortunately was still where he had left it, the group made the long journey back to New Orleans. The sun was rising when they finally reached the city. Thorne went straight to the office of Federal Marshal Samuel Morrison, one of the few law officers in New Orleans he trusted. Morrison was a tough man from Tennessee who didn't bow to local powers. Thorne told the whole story, showing his wounds as proof. The 3 women confirmed everything. Morrison turned pale upon hearing the names of those involved. Thorne, do you realize the gravity of what you're saying? You're accusing some of the most powerful men in Louisiana of ritual murder. I know what I saw. I know what I experienced." Morrison looked at the terrified women. "Do you three confirm this?" They all nodded. Marie-Claire spoke in a trembling voice. "They kept us there for days. There were others before us. They did terrible things. Things I cannot describe." Morrison rubbed his face wearily. "All right, I'll investigate. But I need you to understand, these people have real power. This won't be easy." And it wasn't. When Morrison and his deputies went to the abandoned plantation, they found only smoking ruins. There were no bodies, no evidence of the rituals, nothing but charred wood and blackened stone. Blackwood and the other accused men presented alibis. They all claimed to be at social events on the night in question, with multiple respectable witnesses confirming their presence. The man Thorne had shot? Never found. The word of Thorne, 3 women of color, and a federal marshal was placed against the word of established aristocrats. In 1834 New Orleans, the outcome was predictable. The judge overseeing the case, a close friend of Blackwood's, dismissed all charges for lack of evidence. Worse still, Blackwood counterattacked, accusing Thorne of trespassing, assault, and defamation. Thorne found himself once again fleeing from the law, but this time for different reasons. Morrison advised him to leave New Orleans. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, friend. These men won't rest until you're dead." On the night before his planned departure, Thorne received a visit in his small room. It was Blackwood. The aristocrat entered calmly, alone, without visible weapons. He sat in the room's only chair, as if it were his own mansion. "I've come to offer a deal," Blackwood said, his southern drawl still polished. "Leave New Orleans, never return, never speak of what you saw, and you'll live. Continue causing trouble, and I guarantee you won't see another dawn." Thorne, his hand on his reloaded revolver, responded, "How can I trust the word of a monster?" "Because monsters, Mr. Thorne, understand pragmatism. Killing you now would cause more problems than letting you live in silence. Marshal Morrison has his eye on me now. Another accident would be suspicious, but if you simply disappear, head west or north, then the case dies naturally. And the women, Marie-Claire and the others, they're insignificant. Nobody will listen to their stories. They're already seen as hysterical or liars, but you, with your reputation as an investigator, are different. That's why I offer this deal." Thorne wanted to refuse, wanted to shoot the man right there, but he knew Blackwood was right. Without evidence, without official support, he was just one man against an entire system. "All right," he finally said, defeat bitter in his mouth. "But know this, Blackwood, one day somehow, men like you will answer for what you've done." Blackwood smiled coldly. "Perhaps, but not today, and probably not in my lifetime." He stood to leave, but paused at the door. "Oh, and Mr. Thorne, if you ever change your mind about our deal, I have people in every city between here and San Francisco. You'll never truly be safe." And then he left, leaving Thorne alone with his helplessness and fury. Thorne left New Orleans the next day, but first he did 3 things. First, he gave all the money he had to Celeste Rousseau, enough for her and Marie-Claire to start over somewhere else, far from Blackwood's shadow. Second, he wrote a detailed account of everything that had happened, sealed it, and left it with Morrison, instructing him to make it public if anything happened to him. Third, he visited an old voodoo mambo named Mama Laveau in the Treme. She was known for her power and wisdom, a woman who knew the deepest secrets of New Orleans. "I've come to ask for help," Thorne said. "Or perhaps vengeance." Mama Laveau, an elderly woman with eyes that seemed to see through time, studied him for a long moment. "You found true evil, white man. Evil that uses our symbols, that steals our practices and twists them for its own obscene purposes. You know about Blackwood? We all know those who see. There have been men like him since this city existed. They feed on the blood of the forgotten, the invisible. But the universe maintains balance. What he does will return to him. Maybe not today, not tomorrow, but it will return." "How long?" She shook her head. "It's not your job to wait. You did what you could. You saved 3 souls. That counts. Now go, live your life. Blackwood's evil is his own burden to carry." Thorne left for Texas, then Colorado, trying to rebuild his life once again. But he never forgot that night in the bayou, never stopped dreaming about that basement and the things he saw there. Cornelius Blackwood continued his life of privilege and power. He married a beautiful heiress from Natchez, had 3 children, expanded his fortune. To the outside world, he was the perfect example of a Southern gentleman. But the disappearances of women of color continued in New Orleans. Not frequently. Blackwood had become more cautious after the incident with Thorne, but regularly enough for those paying attention to notice a pattern. Marie-Claire Rousseau and her mother moved to Mobile, Alabama, where they began a new life. Marie-Claire never married, never fully overcame the trauma of what she experienced. She died young, at 32, of a fever. Some said she simply lost the will to live. Marshall Morrison continued investigating discreetly, but without success. Blackwood's tentacles reached too far, protected by money and social position. And then, in 1847, 13 years after that terrible night, something changed. Blackwood was at one of his cotton properties when a slave revolt broke out. It was something relatively common at the time, desperate workers seeking freedom. But this revolt was different. The slaves, led by a man named Elijah who had been captured in Africa and maintained ancient spiritual traditions, seemed to have a specific objective: Cornelius Blackwood. They invaded the main house, ignoring the other whites present, focusing only on the property owner. Blackwood tried to flee but was cornered in one of the barns. What happened inside was never fully clarified. When the local militia finally arrived and regained control, they found Blackwood dead. His body was covered with strange symbols, drawn in his own blood. His eyes were open, fixed in eternal terror. Elijah and the other revolt leaders were publicly hanged, as was customary. But before dying, Elijah said something that was recorded by one of the witnesses. The demon of the bayou finally paid his price. The souls he consumed finally consumed him. Blackwood's death was officially classified as the result of a slave revolt. But those who knew the truth, and there were some, saw something more. A form of cosmic justice, perhaps, or simply the universe correcting an imbalance. When Ezekiel Thorne, now living under another name in Colorado, learned of Blackwood's death through an old newspaper, he felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not relief, just a deep weariness. He thought of Marie-Claire, dead too young. He thought of the other women he couldn't save. He thought of all the monsters who walked freely because they had money and power to protect themselves, and he wondered if any justice was ever truly enough. Thorne died in 1869, at 72, on a small ranch in Colorado. In his papers, his heirs found a detailed account of his life in New Orleans and that terrible night in the bayou. The document ended with these words: "Let this story serve as a warning. Evil does not wear only the faces we expect. Often it wears the mask of respectability, of wealth, of culture. True monsters don't live in dark forests, but in illuminated mansions. And the greatest tragedy is that our world often prefers to protect these monsters rather than their victims. I fought one of them and lost, but I saved 3 lives. Perhaps that has to be enough. Perhaps small victories are all we can hope for in a world that values power over justice." The account was eventually published in 1891 by a historian who found it at an estate auction. It caused a small sensation in some academic circles, but was largely dismissed as Gothic fiction or the exaggeration of an old investigator. Blackwood's mansion in the Garden District has changed hands many times over the years. Residents report strange phenomena, voices in the night, shadows moving without a source, an oppressive feeling of fear in certain rooms. And in the bayou south of New Orleans, fishermen and hunters occasionally find ruins of old plantations covered by vegetation and time. Some say that on moonless nights you can still hear echoes of ancient rituals, screams of victims long dead, promises of power that come at a terrible price. The story of the demon of the bayou became part of Louisiana folklore, just another ghost story to frighten tourists. The truth that it really happened, that real men committed real atrocities against real people, was diluted and romanticized until it became just another legend. And perhaps that's the scariest part of all. Not the rituals or the murders, but how easily society forgets, how readily it protects its powerful, how willing it is to dismiss victims as irrelevant. Cornelius Blackwood was buried in Lafayette Cemetery No. 1, in an elaborate marble tomb that eventually deteriorated and was forgotten. Tourists pass by it without knowing who the man buried there was, what secrets he kept, how many lives he destroyed. And on silent nights in New Orleans, when the wind blows from the bayous bringing the smell of stagnant water and decomposing vegetation, Some say you can still feel the presence of evil that once walked freely through those streets. Because monsters don't die easily. They just change faces, adapt to new times, find new ways to feed on the vulnerable. The story of Ezekiel Thorne and Cornelius Blackwood is a reminder that the struggle between justice and power is eternal, that heroes often lose, that victims rarely receive the recognition they deserve. But it's also a reminder that it's worth fighting, even when you know you might lose. Because Thorne saved 3 lives that night. 3 women who would have died on a profane altar lived because one man chose to do what was right, not what was easy. And in the end, perhaps that's what defines not the monsters, but the heroes. Not their victory, but their willingness to try, even against impossible odds, even knowing they might lose. The demon of the bayou finally fell, not by the law of men, but by something older and deeper. And Ezekiel Thorne, scarred and broken by the experience, still lived knowing he had made a difference, however small. Sometimes, small differences are all we have, and sometimes they're enough.